The morning mist clung to the granite walls of Yosemite Valley like a shroud, obscuring the towering peaks that had drawn countless adventurers to this sacred wilderness for over a century. It was June 15th, 1988, and 24-year-old Marcus Chen was experiencing his first solo camping trip in the legendary national park, a journey that represented far more than simple recreation. Fresh out of UC Berkeley, with a degree in environmental science and a burning passion for wilderness conservation, Marcus had convinced his worried parents that this expedition was essential for his soul, a rite of passage before starting his career with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Marcus had spent months meticulously planning every detail of his week-long expedition through the backcountry of Yosemite's high country. His forest-green Honda Civic, now dusty from the long drive up Highway 120, sat loaded with carefully selected gear. A worn canvas tent that had belonged to his grandfather, a down sleeping bag rated for mountain temperatures, enough freeze-dried meals to last 10 days, water purification tablets, topographic maps wrapped in waterproof cases, and a first aid kit that his mother had obsessively stocked with every possible emergency supply. Most importantly, Marcus carried his prized possession, a Canon AE 135mm camera with 6 rolls of Kodak film, determined to document the pristine beauty of the Sierra Nevada backcountry for his photography portfolio. Photography had been Marcus's passion since high school, when his art teacher had introduced him to the works of Ansel Adams and convinced him that images could be powerful tools for environmental advocacy. Marcus dreamed of combining his scientific training with his artistic vision, creating photographs that would inspire others to protect America's remaining wilderness areas. If you're following this mysterious story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from around the world who share our fascination with unsolved mysteries. The young man had arrived at Tuolumne Meadows the previous evening, setting up his first camp at the established campground before heading into the wilderness proper. The high-altitude meadow, situated at 8,600 feet above sea level, represented a dramatic transition from the oak woodlands and chaparral of California's Central Valley to the alpine environment of the Sierra Nevada. Marcus had spent his first evening photographing the golden light as it painted the granite domes surrounding the meadow, capturing images of Cathedral Peak and Unicorn Peak that would later be developed and cherished by his family. His planned route was ambitious, but well within his capabilities as an experienced hiker. Marcus intended to follow the Glen Aulin Trail northward from Tuolumne Meadows, descending through a series of spectacular waterfalls, including Tuolumne Falls, White Cascade, and ultimately reaching Waterwheel Falls, a unique granite formation where the Tuolumne River creates natural waterwheels as it cascades over smooth rock formations. From there, he planned to establish a base camp and spend several days exploring the remote alpine lakes and granite peaks of the northern Yosemite wilderness. Marcus had obtained all necessary wilderness permits through the National Park Service's reservation system, a bureaucratic process that he had navigated with the patience of someone who understood the importance of protecting fragile alpine ecosystems from overuse. He had left detailed itineraries with both the park rangers at the Tuolumne Meadows Wilderness Center and his roommate, David Kim, back in Berkeley. David, a fellow environmental science graduate who had known Marcus since their freshman year, was accustomed to his friend's solo adventures, but had insisted on specific check-in procedures and emergency contacts. The weather forecast for the week looked ideal. Clear skies with daytime temperatures in the 70s and nighttime lows in the 40s, perfect conditions for backcountry photography and comfortable camping. Marcus had studied the seasonal patterns of Sierra Nevada weather extensively, understanding that summer thunderstorms could develop rapidly in the afternoon hours and that creek crossings could become dangerous with snowmelt or sudden precipitation. On the morning of June 16th, Marcus shouldered his pack and headed north from Tuolumne Meadows along the Glen Orlin Trail, his camera hanging from a padded strap across his chest and his spirits soaring with anticipation. He had risen before dawn to photograph the alpenglow on the surrounding granite peaks, capturing images of the first light touching the summit of Mount Conness and the dramatic silhouette of Cathedral Range against the brightening sky. Marcus Chen still remembered the last phone call from her son, made from a payphone outside the Tuolumne Meadows Visitor Center on the evening before his departure into the backcountry. "The mountains are incredible, Mom," Marcus had said, his voice crackling through the static of the old telephone connection. "I can see why John Muir called this the range of light. The way the granite catches and reflects the morning sun is like nothing I've ever experienced. I'm going to take some pictures that will blow your mind, maybe even good enough for National Geographic someday." Those optimistic words, filled with the enthusiasm and dreams of a young man embarking on his greatest adventure, would be the last that Marcus Chen would ever hear from her only child. At the time, she had felt the familiar mixture of pride and worry that characterized her relationship with Marcus's wilderness pursuits. But she had learned to trust his competence and judgment during his college years of increasingly ambitious outdoor expeditions. Marcus had inherited his love of nature from both sides of his family. His father, Robert Chen, was a mechanical engineer who had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s and had discovered hiking as a way to explore his adopted homeland. His mother, Margaret, was a second-generation Chinese-American who taught high school mathematics in San Francisco's Richmond district and had initially been skeptical of her son's passion for spending time in remote wilderness areas. The family had taken numerous camping trips together during Marcus's childhood, mostly to established campgrounds in state parks. But Marcus had always been drawn to the more remote and challenging destinations. By high school, he was leading hiking trips for his Boy Scout troop and had earned the rank of Eagle Scout with a conservation project that involved trail restoration in the Marin Headlands. When Marcus failed to return to his designated pickup point at Tuolumne Meadows on June 22, 1988, David Kim waited until the evening hours before taking action, knowing his friend's tendency to extend trips when exceptional photographic opportunities presented themselves. However, when Marcus still hadn't appeared by nightfall, David's mild concern transformed into genuine alarm. He drove through the darkness to the Tuolumne Meadows Ranger Station, where he found Ranger Thomas Hartwell completing his evening patrol reports under the harsh fluorescent lights of the small administrative building. Ranger Hartwell, a 15-year veteran of Yosemite's wilderness operations who had coordinated dozens of search and rescue missions during his distinguished career, immediately recognized the signs that distinguished a genuine emergency from a simple miscommunication or delayed return. David's detailed knowledge of Marcus's extensive wilderness experience, his high-quality equipment, and his reliable history of adhering to established timelines and check-in procedures, combined with the young man's methodical approach to trip planning, convinced Hartwell that immediate action was warranted despite the late hour. By dawn on June 23rd, a preliminary search team was assembled at the Tuolumne Meadows staging area, their breath visible in the crisp mountain air as they reviewed topographic maps and established communication protocols. The initial response included 4 experienced park rangers with wilderness rescue specializations, 2 volunteer searchers from the Yosemite Search and Rescue Team who had been contacted at their homes in the pre-dawn hours, and Rex, a German shepherd with specialized training in locating missing persons in challenging wilderness environments. The morning was crystalline clear, with unlimited visibility extending for miles across the granite landscape. ideal conditions for both systematic ground searches and potential helicopter operations if the search needed to be expanded. The absence of weather complications meant that searchers could focus entirely on covering ground and following leads without the additional challenges of rain, snow, or extreme temperatures that could hamper such operations and endanger both the missing person and the rescue teams. Ranger Hartwell, drawing on his extensive experience with wilderness emergencies, developed a systematic search strategy that focused initially on Marcus's documented planned route along the well-established Glen Aulin Trail. This trail was considered relatively safe by Yosemite standards, featuring clearly marked routes, properly maintained creek crossings, and regular maintenance by Park Service trail crews who ensured that bridges, signs, and emergency markers remained in good condition throughout the hiking season. However, experienced searchers like Hartwell understood that even the most familiar and well-maintained trails could present unexpected dangers, particularly for solo travelers who might become disoriented, injured, or face medical emergencies without immediate assistance available. The Sierra Nevada wilderness was unforgiving to those who made even small mistakes in judgment or who encountered unexpected circumstances beyond their control. The search teams were divided into systematic patterns, with each group assigned specific trail segments and potential camping areas where Marcus might have established overnight stops according to his detailed itinerary. The searchers carried state-of-the-art radio communications equipment, detailed topographic maps marked with GPS coordinates, comprehensive emergency medical supplies, and were prepared for scenarios ranging from simple navigation errors to serious trauma requiring immediate helicopter evacuation to medical facilities in the Central Valley. Rex and his handler, Ranger Patricia Morrison, began their tracking effort from Marcus's registered parking spot near the Tuolumne Meadows trailhead, hoping to establish a clear scent trail that would indicate his actual direction of travel and potentially reveal any deviations from his planned route. Rex had successfully located missing persons in over 30 previous cases during his 5-year career with the Park Service, and his ability to follow even faint scent traces across granite terrain had proven invaluable in previous search operations. The first significant discovery came during the afternoon hours of June 23rd, when the tracking team located clear boot prints matching the distinctive tread pattern of Marcus's Vask hiking boots at several strategic points along the Glen Aulin trail system. The tracks appeared normal and purposeful, following the established trail route without any obvious signs of distress, deviation from the marked path, or evidence of the kind of erratic movement that might indicate injury, disorientation, or panic. At White Cascade, approximately 4 miles from the Tuolumne Meadows trailhead, where the trail descended through a spectacular series of granite pools and waterfalls, searchers discovered evidence of what appeared to be a brief rest stop. The granite slabs showed disturbed areas where someone had sat against a large boulder, and investigators found what appeared to be a lens cap for a 35mm camera wedged in a crack between rocks, though it was impossible to determine definitively whether the cap belonged to Marcus or had been dropped by another photographer at some earlier time. As the search operation expanded on June 24th, additional teams were brought in from neighboring ranger districts throughout the Sierra Nevada region, and the operation began to take on the systematic intensity and resource allocation that characterized major wilderness rescue efforts in America's most challenging mountain environments. Volunteers from local hiking clubs, experienced mountaineers from the Bay Area climbing community, and off-duty emergency responders from surrounding counties responded to radio appeals for assistance, creating a coordinated effort that would eventually involve over 200 searchers. The weather remained cooperative throughout the initial search period, with clear skies, mild temperatures, and excellent visibility that allowed ground teams to cover significant terrain without the complications of inclement weather that could hamper search operations and create additional safety concerns for the large number of volunteers working in remote and potentially dangerous areas. The breakthrough discovery that would transform the entire nature of the search effort came late in the afternoon of June 24th, when Ranger Morrison and Rex located Marcus's campsite in a designated wilderness camping area near Glen Orlin, approximately 6 miles from the trailhead beside the swift-flowing Tuolumne River. However, the condition of the campsite immediately raised troubling questions that transformed what had begun as a routine search and rescue operation into something far more complex and potentially sinister. Marcus's tent remained standing in the designated camping area, but it appeared to have been hastily abandoned under circumstances that experienced wilderness professionals found deeply concerning. The tent's rainfly was partially detached and flapping in the mountain breeze, while the entrance door had been left wide open despite evening temperatures that would have made such exposure uncomfortable for anyone sleeping inside the shelter. Most disturbing was the condition of Marcus's sleeping area inside the tent. His sleeping bag lay unzipped and partially pulled from the tent opening, as if someone had been resting and then quickly exited the shelter or had possibly been removed from it under urgent or threatening circumstances. The position and condition of the sleeping bag suggested rapid departure rather than the normal methodical packing routine that David Kim and Marcus's family knew to be characteristic of his careful and organized approach to wilderness camping. The majority of Marcus's camping equipment remained inside the tent in good condition, his backpack containing food supplies that were largely untouched, his camp stove and cooking equipment arranged with the systematic organization that marked him as an experienced outdoorsman, extra clothing folded in stuff sacks according to the efficient packing system he had developed during years of wilderness travel, and his water purification equipment and first aid supplies properly stored and easily accessible. However, several critical items were conspicuously absent from the campsite, and their absence suggested a pattern that experienced searchers found significant. Marcus's hiking boots were missing from the tent area, along with his lightweight day pack, his water bottles, and most importantly, his prized Canon AE-1 camera, with all of its associated photography equipment, including lenses, filters, and film supplies. The official search for Marcus Chen was suspended on July 8, 1988, after nearly 3 weeks of intensive effort that had covered more than 50 square miles of some of the most challenging and unforgiving wilderness terrain in North America. Ranger Hartwell made the difficult decision to scale back active operations as early winter weather patterns began to threaten the high country with sudden snowstorms and freezing temperatures, and as volunteer resources became increasingly stretched beyond sustainable limits. The search had grown to involve over 200 dedicated volunteers, including park rangers from throughout the entire Sierra Nevada region, members of volunteer search and rescue organizations from surrounding counties who had donated hundreds of hours of their time, hiking clubs and mountaineering groups from the San Francisco Bay Area who had responded to radio appeals and newspaper coverage, and even military personnel from nearby installations who had contributed helicopter support and specialized equipment during the most intensive phases of the operation. Despite the massive scale of the effort and the systematic, professional approach taken by experienced wilderness rescue specialists, the search teams had found no additional trace of Marcus beyond his mysteriously abandoned campsite near Glen Orlin. The terrain had proven to be both spectacularly beautiful and utterly unforgiving. Steep granite slabs where a single misstep could result in fatal falls, swift-moving water features where drowning remained a constant risk even for experienced outdoor enthusiasts, dense forests of lodgepole pine and red fir where someone could become completely lost within yards of established trails, and numerous geological features including crevasses, caves, and hidden ravines where a person could disappear entirely. However, the suspension of official search operations did not mark the end of the Chen family's determined efforts to find their son. It merely marked the beginning of a different, more personal kind of searching that would continue with unwavering dedication for nearly 2 decades. Margaret and Robert Chen refused to accept that Marcus had simply vanished without explanation into the granite wilderness, and they committed themselves to a long-term investigation that would consume their financial resources, their emotional energy, and ultimately transform their understanding of the dangers that existed in America's most pristine wilderness areas. Throughout the remainder of 1988 and continuing into 1989, the Chen family privately funded additional search efforts, hiring experienced private investigators who specialized in wilderness cases, offering substantial monetary rewards for any information that might lead to Marcus's discovery, and commissioning aerial photography surveys of remote areas that had been inaccessible to ground-based search teams during the original operation. They consulted with experts in wilderness survival techniques, seeking insights into how someone with Marcus's level of experience might have responded to various emergency scenarios. They met with specialists in missing persons investigations who had worked on similar cases throughout the American West, hoping to identify patterns or connections that might have been overlooked during the initial investigation. Each consultation provided new possibilities and theories to consider, but none yielded the concrete evidence or credible leads that might have provided the resolution the family desperately sought. Dr. James Patterson, a respected criminologist at UC Davis, who had specialized in missing persons cases occurring in national park settings, reviewed all available evidence and provided a sobering professional assessment of the challenges facing any continued investigation. The Sierra Nevada wilderness presents unique difficulties for both search operations and criminal investigations, Dr. Patterson explained to the Chen family during a lengthy consultation session in the fall of 1988. The granite terrain preserves very little evidence of human passage, especially after exposure to seasonal weather cycles. Snow, rain, wind, and temperature extremes can eliminate organic traces within days of deposition. However, Dr. Patterson also noted several aspects of Marcus's disappearance that distinguished it from typical wilderness accidents and suggested that alternative explanations deserved serious consideration. The highly selective nature of the missing items, boots, daypack, camera equipment, suggests purposeful departure from the campsite rather than sudden medical emergency or panic response, he observed. Most wilderness accident victims leave behind obvious disturbance patterns at their last known location, scattered equipment, or other signs of distress. The relatively organized condition of Mr. Chen's campsite suggests he departed voluntarily, possibly in response to something he observed or someone he encountered. Indeed, as autumn arrived in the Sierra Nevada and early snowfall began to dust the high peaks with white, making further search efforts impossible until the following spring, the Chen family was forced to return to their normal daily routines in San Francisco. However, their lives had been permanently altered by Marcus's absence and the devastating uncertainty surrounding his fate. Margaret found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on her mathematics teaching responsibilities, while Robert channeled his grief into his engineering work, with an intensity that his colleagues recognized as a coping mechanism rather than genuine professional enthusiasm. The case remained officially open in the files of both the National Park Service and the Mariposa County Sheriff's Office, ensuring that any new evidence or leads would receive appropriate investigation. However, as months passed without developments, investigative resources were necessarily redirected to more recent cases and ongoing emergencies that demanded immediate attention from law enforcement agencies already stretched thin by the demands of covering vast rural areas with limited personnel. Marcus's disappearance joined the unfortunate ranks of unsolved missing persons cases that accumulated in law enforcement files throughout the American West. Cases that represented not merely statistical entries in databases, but real families living with the devastating daily reality of never knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Each case file represented parents, siblings, spouses, and children who continued to hope against increasingly impossible odds that someday they would receive the phone call or visit that would finally provide answers. Throughout 1989, 1990, and into the early 1990s, the Chen family maintained their commitment to annual pilgrimages to Yosemite, carefully timing their visits to coincide with the anniversary of Marcus's disappearance and using each trip as an opportunity to conduct their own systematic searches of areas that had not been thoroughly investigated during the original massive search effort. They became familiar and respected figures to the park rangers, seasonal employees, and longtime Yosemite visitors who recognized them as the parents who had never stopped looking for their missing son. Margaret developed meaningful relationships with other families who had lost loved ones in wilderness areas throughout the western United States, finding both emotional comfort and additional motivation in their shared experiences of loss and continuing hope. Through these connections, she learned about the disturbing frequency of unexplained disappearances in national parks and wilderness areas, and she began to suspect that Marcus's case might be part of a larger, more complex pattern that law enforcement agencies were either unaware of or reluctant to acknowledge publicly due to concerns about tourism and public confidence in park safety. The Chen family's persistent and methodical approach to continuing their search led to several instances of false hope over the intervening years. In 1991, hikers in the Ansel Adams Wilderness reported finding camera equipment in a remote alpine basin, but detailed investigation revealed that the equipment belonged to a different missing person from an earlier decade whose case had also never been resolved. In 1994, human remains were discovered near Mammoth Lakes by cross-country skiers, but forensic analysis determined that the remains were not those of Marcus and appeared to be related to a climbing accident that had occurred during the 1970s. Each false lead proved emotionally devastating for the family, reopening psychological wounds that had begun to develop protective scar tissue and forcing them to relive the trauma of Marcus's disappearance. However, each disappointment also served to reinforce their determination to continue searching and to keep their son's case active in public consciousness through whatever means remained available to them. The development and popularization of the Internet during the mid-1990s provided new opportunities for the Chen family to publicize Marcus's disappearance and connect with other families facing similar tragic circumstances. Margaret taught herself to use computer technology and created one of the early missing persons websites, featuring Marcus's photographs from happier times, detailed information about the circumstances of his disappearance, maps of the search areas, and appeals for any information that might be relevant to resolving his case. The website generated responses from around the world, including contacts from people who claimed to have seen someone matching Marcus's description in various locations throughout the western United States and even in foreign countries. While the vast majority of these reports eventually proved to be cases of mistaken identity, wishful thinking, or deliberate hoaxes, the family investigated each potential lead with the same thoroughness that had characterized their search efforts since 1988. The call that would forever change the trajectory of Marcus Chen's case came on a rain-soaked morning in March 2006. Nearly 18 years after his disappearance had transformed the Chen family's life into an endless cycle of hope and heartbreak. Margaret Chen, now in her early 60s, with silver threading through her black hair and the kind of quiet dignity that comes from years of bearing unbearable uncertainty, was preparing for another day of teaching algebra to distracted teenagers when the telephone rang in her Richmond district kitchen. The morning fog was still thick outside her windows, characteristic of San Francisco's unpredictable spring weather, muffling the familiar sounds of the city waking up around her. Margaret had developed a routine over the years that allowed her to function despite the constant background awareness of her son's absence. Coffee at precisely 6:30, review of lesson plans while eating toast, departure for school at 7:15 to arrive before her students and establish the calm, organized classroom environment that had made her a respected teacher, despite the personal tragedy that shadowed her professional life. Mrs. Chen, this is Detective Sarah Mitchell from the Mariposa County Sheriff's Office, the voice on the phone said, carrying the careful formality and measured tone of someone who had learned through experience to deliver potentially life-altering information with professional restraint. I'm calling about your son's case. We've recovered some items that may have belonged to Marcus, and I believe you'll want to know about this development immediately. Margaret's hands began to tremble as she set down her coffee mug, the ceramic clicking against the kitchen counter with unusual loudness in the suddenly quiet room. After 18 years of living with uncertainty, of imagining countless scenarios and possibilities during sleepless nights, of maintaining hope despite the statistical reality that Marcus was almost certainly dead, tangible evidence had finally emerged from the wilderness that had claimed her son. "What kind of items?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow cause this moment to evaporate like so many false hopes before it. "A hiker discovered what appears to be a camera bag in a remote area near Waterwheel Falls," Detective Mitchell explained carefully. "The bag contains a Canon AE-1 camera and other photography equipment that matches the description of items your son was carrying when he disappeared. We also found what appears to be exposed film that we're hoping to develop and analyze." The discovery had been made by Jennifer Walsh, a 34-year-old wildlife biologist from Fresno, who was conducting a comprehensive long-term study of mule deer population dynamics in the remote northern sections of Yosemite's wilderness area. Jennifer had been working under a special research permit that allowed her access to areas typically off-limits to casual hikers, and she had been systematically documenting animal movement patterns, feeding behaviors, and seasonal migration routes along the less-traveled sections of the Glen Aulin Trail system. On March 15, 2006, Jennifer had been methodically photographing deer tracks and other wildlife sign near a massive granite outcropping approximately 2 miles downstream from the spectacular Waterwheel Falls formation, when she noticed something obviously unnatural, wedged tightly between two house-sized boulders that had been deposited in their current position by ancient glacial activity thousands of years earlier. Initially, Jennifer had dismissed the object as unfortunately common litter, the kind of modern debris that occasionally accumulated in even the most remote wilderness areas, despite leave-no-trace principles and strict National Park Service regulations. However, as she approached the object for closer scientific inspection, she realized that whatever was trapped between the rocks had been in place for a considerable period of time, far longer than typical camping debris or accidentally dropped equipment. What appeared to be a canvas camera bag was deeply embedded in the narrow crevice between the granite boulders, partially buried under nearly 2 decades of accumulated organic debris, including pine needles, decomposing leaves, small branches, and sediment deposits from periodic flooding during spring snowmelt periods when the Tuolumne River system could rise dramatically and carry debris far from its normal channels. The canvas material had been bleached to a pale, almost white color by years of intense ultraviolet exposure at high altitude, and the bag's original shape was significantly distorted by the immense pressure of the rocks and the accumulated weight of debris that had collected on top of it over the years. Metal hardware, including zippers, buckles, and reinforcing grommets, had developed the greenish patina of long-term oxidation, while leather trim had cracked and hardened from repeated cycles of wetting and drying. Jennifer's scientific training in archaeological field techniques and her experience with evidence preservation made her immediately realize that this discovery might represent significant evidence rather than simple abandoned equipment. Before attempting to extract the bag from its granite prison, she carefully photographed its position from multiple angles, created detailed notes about its location and condition, and used her GPS unit to record precise coordinates that would allow investigators to relocate the exact spot, if necessary, for further investigation. When Jennifer finally succeeded in freeing the camera bag from between the boulders, using careful techniques designed to preserve any potential evidence, she immediately recognized that its contents might be directly related to one of the unsolved missing persons cases that were periodically discussed in outdoor recreation communities throughout the Sierra Nevada region. The bag contained a Canon AE-1 camera body that appeared to match the vintage and specifications that would have been common during the 1980s, several rolls of what appeared to be exposed 35mm film, various lens filters and photography accessories, and a partially legible equipment inventory written in careful handwriting on a piece of paper that had been stored in one of the bag's interior pockets and protected from the worst environmental damage. While much of the handwritten inventory had been destroyed by moisture, age, and repeated temperature cycling, Jennifer could make out what appeared to be a name written in block letters, M. Chen, followed by what looked like a partial address referencing Berkeley, California. The forensic examination of Marcus Chen's recovered camera equipment took place in the controlled environment of the Mariposa County Sheriff's Department's Evidence Laboratory, where Detective Sarah Mitchell worked alongside Roy Sandoval, a specialist in forensic photography who had developed film evidence in numerous criminal cases throughout his 20-year career. The process of attempting to recover images from 18-year-old film that had been subjected to extreme environmental conditions represented both a technical challenge and an emotional watershed for the Chen family, who had waited nearly 2 decades for any concrete evidence about their son's fate. Margaret and Robert Chen made the drive to Mariposa County on a clear April morning in 2006. Their hands clasped tightly together as they navigated the familiar winding mountain roads that led from the Central Valley up into the Sierra Nevada foothills. The journey took them through some of the same granite landscape where Marcus had vanished, and both parents found themselves studying the rock formations, forested valleys, and distant peaks with renewed intensity, wondering if their son's final moments had somehow played out in these beautiful but unforgiving mountains. Detective Mitchell had carefully prepared for the family's visit, arranging for a victim's advocate to be present and consulting with forensic psychologists about the most appropriate approaches for presenting potentially disturbing photographic evidence to family members who had endured nearly 2 decades of uncertainty and emotional trauma. "I need to prepare you for what we've recovered," Detective Mitchell said gently, as she arranged the developed photographs on the conference room table with the systematic care of someone who understood the profound impact these images would have. These photographs may raise more questions than they answer, and some of what Marcus documented might be difficult for you to see. However, they also provide the first concrete evidence we've had about what happened to your son during his final days, and they may ultimately help us understand the circumstances that led to his disappearance. The film development process had taken several days, with Roy Sandoval working methodically in the red-lit darkness of his laboratory, using specialized techniques designed to maximize the recovery of any surviving images from photographic materials that had been subjected to temperature extremes, moisture fluctuations, and chemical contamination over nearly 2 decades. Film this old is completely unpredictable, Sandoval had explained to Detective Mitchell as they prepared to begin the delicate process. Environmental factors sometimes actually help preserve images by creating natural stabilization of the emulsion, but more often you end up with nothing but chemical fog and complete deterioration of the image-forming layers. We won't know what we have until we get into the darkroom and see what develops in the chemical baths. The first roll of film had yielded mostly blank frames and abstract patterns of light and chemical deterioration, exactly the kind of disappointing results that Sandoval had expected, given the age and environmental exposure of the materials. The second roll had been completely degraded, its photographic emulsion having separated entirely from the acetate film base during years of repeated moisture exposure, leaving nothing but clear plastic with no recoverable image information. However, the third roll of film, which had been partially wound into the camera's internal mechanism and thus afforded some additional protection from environmental factors, began to reveal ghostly, fragmentary images that made both Sandoval and Detective Mitchell realize they were dealing with something far more significant than routine evidence recovery. The first photographs in the chronological sequence brought both profound joy and heartbreaking sorrow to Marcus's parents. Several clear images showed Marcus himself, obviously taken using the camera's self-timer function during the early, happy days of his wilderness expedition. He appeared healthy, confident, and completely in his element, grinning broadly beside his carefully organized campsite, holding up a freshly caught trout near a crystal-clear mountain stream, pointing excitedly toward massive granite formations that rose like ancient monuments from the surrounding forest. These were the images of a young man fully alive and passionate about his wilderness adventure, completely unaware that danger was approaching from an unknown direction. Margaret Chen studied each photograph with the desperate intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail of her son's final, documented moments of happiness and enthusiasm. "He looks so excited," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "So confident about what he was discovering out there in those mountains." However, the chronological progression of the recovered photographs revealed a dramatic and disturbing change in both photographic composition and the apparent circumstances under which the images had been captured. The scenic landscape photographs and cheerful self-portraits were followed by a series of images that appeared to have been taken hurriedly, with shaky composition, uncertain focus, and framing that suggested Marcus had been moving quickly or operating under significant stress when he captured these final frames. One particularly intriguing and troubling image showed what appeared to be another person visible in the distance, captured as a dark, indistinct silhouette against the granite landscape. The figure was too far away and the image quality too degraded to allow for any possibility of identification, but the person's posture and positioning in the frame suggested they might have been watching or deliberately following Marcus, rather than simply hiking independently in the same general area. another photograph in the disturbing final sequence captured what looked unmistakably like the interior of a wooden structure, possibly a primitive cabin or rough shelter, illuminated by harsh artificial lighting that seemed completely out of place in the pristine wilderness setting that Marcus had been documenting. The image was taken at an unusual angle and with obvious haste, as if Marcus had been trying to document his surroundings while concealing the fact that he was taking photographs. The final frame on the recovered roll was the most disturbing image of all, showing what appeared to be rope or restraint materials, along with what might have been a human hand or arm, though the severely degraded condition of the film and the chaotic composition made definitive identification impossible. The photograph appeared to have been taken at close range in poor lighting conditions, possibly at night or in an enclosed space, and the camera angle suggested it might have been captured as the camera was dropped or thrown. Robert Chen studied the photographs with the analytical mind that had served him well throughout his engineering career, but his scientific approach could not protect him from the devastating emotional impact of seeing his son's final documented moments. "These don't look like accident photographs," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of grief and growing anger. Someone else was definitely there with Marcus, someone he was afraid of, someone he was trying to gather evidence about. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought into the investigation within days of the photograph recovery, along with digital enhancement specialists who employed cutting-edge forensic imaging techniques to extract every possible detail from the severely degraded film. Agent Patricia Vega, a veteran investigator who specialized in cold cases involving missing persons in national park settings, immediately recognized patterns in Marcus's final photographs that suggested his disappearance was not the result of a wilderness accident, but rather something far more sinister and deliberate. The chronological progression of these images tells a very clear story, Agent Vega explained to the Chen family during a comprehensive briefing session held at the FBI's Sacramento field office. "Your son was obviously enjoying his wilderness experience initially, but something changed dramatically during his final days. The later photographs suggest he became aware of a significant threat and may have been deliberately trying to document evidence of what was happening to him, possibly hoping that someone would eventually find his camera and understand what had occurred." Agent Vega's analysis of the photographic evidence, combined with her extensive research into similar cases throughout the Sierra Nevada region, revealed a disturbing pattern of unexplained disappearances that had been occurring in the area for several decades. Her investigation uncovered connections between Marcus's case and numerous other unsolved missing persons incidents involving solo hikers, small groups, and families who had vanished under similarly mysterious circumstances throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. Detective Mitchell began systematically re-examining cold case files from Yosemite and surrounding national forest areas, looking for connections and patterns that might have been missed during the original investigations when each case was treated as an isolated incident. The work proved to be painstaking and often frustrating, as many of the original case files were incomplete and key witnesses had moved away, died, or could no longer provide reliable testimony after so many years. One case that immediately drew particular attention was the 1987 disappearance of Lisa Morrison, a 28-year-old elementary school teacher from Los Angeles who had vanished while backpacking alone in the Ansel Adams Wilderness area, located just south of Yosemite National Park. Like Marcus, Lisa had been an experienced hiker with extensive wilderness knowledge, who had left detailed itineraries with family members and had maintained regular communication until she suddenly stopped reporting to her designated emergency contact. Another parallel case involved the Nakamura family, parents Ken and Yuki, along with their two teenage children, who had disappeared in 1989 while car camping at a developed campground near Bass Lake, approximately 1 hour's drive from Yosemite Valley. Their campsite had been discovered by other campers with food still warm on their camp stove and personal belongings undisturbed, but the entire family had vanished without any explanation. Despite extensive searches involving hundreds of volunteers and professional rescue teams, no trace of any family member had ever been found. As Agent Vega compiled her comprehensive analysis, a deeply troubling pattern emerged from the data. All of the connected disappearances had occurred during late spring or early summer months when high country trails were accessible, but tourist traffic remained relatively light compared to peak season periods. All of the cases involved people who were camping or hiking alone or in small groups, away from the more popular and heavily monitored areas of the national parks, where regular ranger patrols and large numbers of other visitors might deter criminal activity. Most significantly, several of the disappearance locations were accessible via little-known logging roads, abandoned mining access routes, or old fire service roads that would have allowed someone with detailed local knowledge to move through the wilderness areas undetected while avoiding the main tourist routes, established campgrounds, and ranger stations where their presence might have been noted and remembered. The investigation took on new urgency when Detective Mitchell discovered that Harold "Buck" Williamson, a 67-year-old former logging contractor who had worked extensively throughout the Sierra Nevada region during the 1980s and early 1990s, had recently been arrested in Oregon for the kidnapping and sexual assault of two female hikers near Crater Lake National Park. Williamson, who was suffering from early-stage dementia and had been living off the grid for many years, had been moving between remote mountain communities while taking seasonal work in logging, mining, and fire suppression operations. During interrogation regarding the Oregon crimes, Williamson's behavior became noticeably agitated when investigators showed him Marcus's recovered photographs, particularly the image showing the interior of what appeared to be a wooden structure. While Williamson continued to deny any involvement in disappearances or other crimes, his attorney noted that he repeatedly muttered references to old mining shacks, keeping them quiet, and nobody goes up there in winter. Further investigation revealed that Williamson had maintained access to several remote cabins and primitive shelters throughout the Sierra Nevada, many of them located on abandoned mining claims or in areas that were technically outside national park boundaries, but easily accessible through backcountry trails and forgotten logging roads. Some of these locations had been used as seasonal hunting camps or equipment storage facilities, while others appeared to have been modified in ways that investigators found deeply disturbing. The breakthrough in the case came when search teams, guided by information extracted from Williamson during his increasingly confused interrogation sessions, located one of his abandoned shelters hidden in a dense grove of trees, less than 2 miles from where Marcus's tent had been found 18 years earlier. The primitive cabin showed clear signs of long-term use, with makeshift sleeping areas, food storage systems, and most disturbing of all, obvious evidence of restraints and confinement that had been built into the structure's design. Forensic analysis of the cabin, using advanced DNA recovery techniques, revealed genetic evidence that definitively matched samples from Marcus's personal effects that the Chen family had preserved throughout the years. Additional evidence suggested that other people had been confined at this location over an extended period, though the degraded condition of most organic materials and the passage of time made specific identification extremely difficult. Marcus Chen stood in the bright morning sunlight outside the Mariposa County Sheriff's Office, feeling an almost overwhelming mixture of relief, vindication, and renewed grief as Detective Mitchell explained the resolution of her son's case. After 18 years of uncertainty, of being told that Marcus had probably died in a hiking accident, of enduring well-meaning suggestions that she should move on and accept what happened, she finally had concrete proof of what she had suspected all along, that her son had been murdered by a predator who had stalked the wilderness areas that Marcus had loved and trusted. Marcus didn't die because he made a mistake or because he was unprepared for the wilderness, Margaret said quietly, her voice filled with a complex mixture of satisfaction and deep sadness. He was killed by someone who used these beautiful mountains as a hunting ground, someone who preyed on people who came to the wilderness seeking peace and natural beauty. The case against Harold Williamson proved to be complicated by his deteriorating mental condition and the passage of nearly 2 decades since the crimes had been committed. However, prosecutors expressed confidence that they had sufficient evidence to pursue multiple charges related to Marcus's death and potentially other connected cases, even if Williamson's dementia made a traditional trial challenging. More importantly for the Chen family and the other families whose loved ones had disappeared in the Sierra Nevada, the investigation had finally provided answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. The knowledge was painful. Marcus and the others had not died peacefully in accidents, but had been victims of deliberate violence. But it also brought the kind of closure that allows families to begin genuine healing rather than endless wondering. Agent Vega continued her investigation into other unsolved disappearances throughout the region, knowing that Williamson's network of hidden shelters and his decades of criminal activity in the wilderness areas might hold evidence of additional crimes. The Sierra Nevada had always been a place where people could disappear into the vastness of the mountains, but now law enforcement understood that sometimes the wilderness itself was not the greatest danger that solo travelers and small groups might face. Marcus Chen returned to her teaching position in San Francisco with a sense of peace that had been absent from her life for 18 years. The camera that had ultimately revealed the truth about Marcus's fate was returned to the family, along with the photographs that documented both his final happy days in the wilderness and his courage in attempting to leave evidence that would someday bring his killer to justice. She kept the camera on the mantel in her living room next to Marcus's college graduation portrait as a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, truth has a way of emerging from the most unlikely places, carried forward by the determination of those who refuse to let the missing be forgotten.